Welcome, everyone. Glad you are here for Pathways to Progress Sojourn Speaker Series. We are winding up our third year thanks to the Breman Foundation. And I think each of these years we've had you, Joy, as a speaker. A Pathways to Progress would not be complete without you. I've had many opportunities to introduce Joy Ladin, and I will get to that in just a moment. I'm Rebecca Staplewax, and I serve as the executive director of SOJOURN, the Southern Jewish Resource Network for Gender and Sexual Diversity. Dr. Joy Ladin has quite academic and literary scholarship, and it's immense. Joy's higher education started at Sarah Lawrence College. She received an MFA at University of Massachusetts and got her PhD in American Literature from Stanford University. Joy has worked at 6 distinguished universities, with the last at Yeshiva University starting in 2003. Joy has 18, I would say, that is beshert, a high number of awards, memoirs and essays and works of poetry. The numbers are mind-boggling. Joy's most recent publications are Once Out of Nature, Family, and Shekhinah Speaks. We'll put that information in the chat so that you have access to finding those online. The first time I met Joy was in 2015, after through the door of life, a Jewish journey between genders came out. We met at the Marcus Jewish Community Center's book festival, and the amazing thing about Joy is that was 2015. In 2016, after the election, Joy called me up and said, "What can I do? How can I help? You're in the South, and I know that there are people that need to talk about gender and God and ways in which we can coexist." And since that time, Joy has come to the South twice. In 2017, I believe we did a road trip of 9 events. And then in 2019, Joy came back. And Joy has been a muse, a mentor, and an inspiration to me, and I think many of you. And a few months ago, I asked Joy, "Where's God? What is God thinking right now?" And I think that Joy did not stop talking for about 10 minutes. And
It's a problem.
it wasn't a problem for me, but what I knew was that it was almost a dissertation. It was an opportunity for us to have another conversation, because I think this is on everyone's mind. How are we going to get through this time with the attack on democracy, the eradication of justice, the fear that many of us are experiencing? And so I want to start off with you, Joy. How have you been preparing? How has your life prepared you and us for this moment?
Well, shortly after the presidential election, I think two things started happening inside me. One was I went into a spiritual freeze. I was really overcome by terror. I was I think like a lot of people, I was um, traumatized by the idea that my country would do this. Um, as one comedian said in 2016, that America would shoot itself in the face. And once is an accident, but the second time you got to start to wonder. Um, so I had this kind of trauma reaction, and it became very difficult for me to locate, just to feel God. I've been very lucky, as you know, all my life. For no, I had an undeserved sense of God's presence. It wasn't the result of spiritual preparation or discipline or anything like that. I lucked into it, and I couldn't feel it. Um, and at the same time, I started thinking compulsively about all the ways in which Judaism is designed to, literally designed. Rabbinic Judaism was invented in the aftermath of the Roman destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. It was built for exile. It was built for living under oppression and tyranny and persecution. It was built in the aftermath of the loss of Jewish sovereignty, the last gasp of Jewish sovereignty before the state of Israel was created again. And many, many aspects of Judaism are designed to give people who are scattered, and I think this has a real resonance for queer people, people who are scattered in small communities that are targeted for oppression, not close to the centers of power, um, to keep going, to keep surviving, and to keep doing that with a sense of joy, with a sense of life, being alive, having a life, and a life in which you can locate divinity, you can locate God. So, you know, I personally do not mourn the destruction of the temple. I do not wish we were still slaughtering masses of animals. Um, but for the Jews up to the destruction of that temple, that was God's address. The temple, if you wanted to, you felt like, wow, I'm missing God, a sense of God's presence. You can just go there. And if you were living in Israel, it wasn't very far. Jerusalem wasn't very far from anybody. So the destruction of the temple, and the Romans were very aware of this. They did this cruel thing where they only permitted Jews to come into the ruins of Jerusalem. They couldn't rebuild Jerusalem. They could come into the ruins one day a year to grieve, to mourn, and otherwise no Jew was permitted in Jerusalem. So this question of where's God that Rebecca asked me is a founding question of what we know as Judaism today, which is not the temple priesthood-centered version of Judaism, but the version that the rabbis of the Talmud and their successors and us have continued to create. And that version was built to survive much worse than what we have yet seen. Um, and for example, one of the problems with um, terrible political changes, with moving into tyranny and oppression, is you lose agency over your life, right? So one of the things that makes it hard to find God is it takes agency to locate divine presence. You have to be able to say, well, I'm here. This is something that I'm determined to do. And if you just feel overwhelmed and helpless, and I don't know about you, but that is like something that is constantly a possibility for me to feel overwhelmed and helpless. It does become hard to locate divine presence. But if you celebrate Shabbat, you can just do it as a resistance practice. Because the one thing people can always do is say, this day is different. If you're not in prison camp, right? There are circumstances in which you can't actually take that time off. If you can take that time off, even if you don't do it religiously, you're exercising agency. But even if you are just saying to yourself, this is Shabbat, I'm living according to this calendar, not the calendar of my oppressors, right? This day is special because it's a day that I am living with a different consciousness, with a different awareness. That's exercising agency. And of course, if you do any kind of religious observance of Shabbat, Shabbat celebrates the one thing that human beings can do that God did in the process of creating the universe. And that one thing is rest, stop doing. The final step in creation is God's like, okay, I'm done. I'm not going to do anything more. And by saying the commandments for Shabbat are like, do this to do what God did, right? Be like God. There aren't many ways, you know. I can't say light and nothing happens if I say light. I guess some people can say, Alexa, make some light or something like that. But, you know, I don't have a smartphone. It's very dumb. So, so I don't have that. But so that the emphasis on what we do interpersonally, the rabbis magnified the parts of the Torah that said, where is God? God is in how we treat one another. They magnified the parts of the Torah that said, when Jews create community and we do things together as Jews, God is there. And they, right? So even if all you can do is just get together, and they did it with Jews, but I think that this can be generalized beyond Jews. I think that we can say when we exercise our agency to spend time with one another, recognize one another's humanity, even if the world around us is not recognizing one another's humanity, that is a place that God is going to be. And the rabbis even invented a special name for divine presence to help people conceptualize this. Because again, in the biblical period, there God wasn't broken into parts and you didn't need special names for this part of God and that part of God. Um, but with the destruction of the temple, the rabbis wanted to answer the question. I think one of the ways Rebecca was saying is, where is God? That I want to talk about separately is the question of, isn't God supposed to be running this show? And if so, why is it going so crappy? And the other, so they magnified roles. These were unfortunately male identified mostly, but images of God running the universe, judging the universe, ruling the universe. These are images that are centered in later prayer traditions. And all of these are images that say, yeah, you know, the people who are jerking you around, who have all the power in your life, they're not actually running the show. No matter what is going on in the human world, believe it, God is transcendent. God's will is transcendent. And even if you can't perceive it. So in doing that, they separated God from the human world, which created a problem, right? Because then the question of where is God, if you just say, oh, don't worry, Rebecca, God's somewhere, but you'll never access God because God's beyond the human world. Rebecca would not have invited me here to say that to you. Um, so then the rabbis invented this term, Shekhinah, which means really it's a name for divine presence. And divine presence to whom? Divine presence to human beings in relation to the human world, in relation to human time and space. So the concept of Shekhinah says, actually, there's always an aspect of God that can be found here. And then they started to elaborate that. Well, when two people are talking about Torah together, the Shekhinah is there. Um, or when you are grieving at a funeral, the Shekhinah is weeping beside you. The Shekhinah was not the God who was out there running the show. In fact, it's they said a bunch of different things. This is not a programmatic. These were not systematic thinkers. These were not theologians. They just made a whole bunch of assertions about the Shekhinah, some of which are contradictory, but some of them, several of them say, when Israel goes into exile, the Shekhinah goes with them. In other words, the Shekhinah is not the part of God that's doing the exiling, because they also said God is doing the exiling, you know, the Romans, whatever, those are just tools. Um, for this transcendent God, for things we may never understand. Um, but the Shekhinah is going with us and is experiencing what we experience. And it's not just the bad stuff. The Shekhinah is also dancing at our funerals. Um, the Shekhinah is with with us so close that another statement says the Shekhinah um, grieves when we're proud, because then there's no room for us to recognize the presence of God inside us, right? We want to magnify ourselves, well, there's no room for God there, and the Shekhinah misses us. So they had a sense of divine presence as all the way to the micro level of our individual psyches, and all the way to the macro level, because some rabbis had a debate about where you can build a tannery. Tanneries stink. So they didn't want to build it where the Shekhinah would be. So where's the Shekhinah? And one said, well, the Shekhinah is in the west, and another said the Shekhinah is in the east. And then several said, actually, the Shekhinah is everywhere. So you've got the Shekhinah that's everywhere, the Shekhinah that is, we can really invoke by doing certain things, right? That we can bring into the human world, and a Shekhinah that's always pervading reality and that's always within us, whether we're aware of it or not. So that is another form of agency that the rabbis wanted us to realize, even in times when we feel helpless. We have the power to be aware or not aware of the presence of divinity. Um,
So in those practical tools, the agency, the ability to mark time, and the opportunity to get together and to see and feel God in different ways, and know what God might be thinking, and the Shekhinah spirit is thinking. It makes me ask, one of the other questions that we first talked about was, and you elaborated so beautifully in terms of this history of ours, and
mm,
how did, I think a lot of folks know how we got here and how we have seen this before. And you had said, they built it for much worse times than this. So can you speak to that in some ways about how the sort of the path in which we are here, and how we can learn
mm,
from our history?
mm. Thank you. That is a great question. Again, Abraham Joshua Heschel really emphasizes the way Judaism works to sculpt time. For Heschel, the real place to look for God is in time. Um, it's not in space, right? Space is the realm of things. It's where you're likely to find, well, somebody marching the National Guard for no reason down the streets of DC, for example, right? So it's in time and the human experience of time that Heschel emphasized it. And that is both in the moment of connection with God. It's everything from that, but Jewish tradition keeps reminding us of what's come before. So the one of the powers that it invites us to seize is this ability to claim a history that goes back to previous, goes back to earliest genocides. Before there really was a Jewish history, there was a genocidal effort by the Egyptians, right? So we have a history of going through really awful things and coming out the other side. And God had already announced God's presence to this family, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Bilhah, Zilpah, right? Right. There was this personal um, sense of God in the family. But for God, and I don't really understand this choice in some ways, but God says over and over again in the Torah, I put you into exile so that I could bring you out, because that's the way I want you to know me. I want our relationship to be founded on your knowledge that I delivered you from the worst. from not just slavery, but from hundreds of years of slavery. And I did this not because you did anything. I just did this. This was part of my design. So God wants to put that at the cornerstone. And so there's an insistence on remembering this long history, which in some ways goes back to the beginning of the creation of the universe. And really, I cheer myself up some days by saying, oh, look at that. The world is still created. It's still there, right? They can't ruin that. No matter how much we screw things up, that stays the same, and we remind ourselves of that every Shabbat, and we celebrate that. But also a lot of really hard things along the way. We remember them, and by remembering them, we are remembering our own endurance over them. We don't erase the suffering, right? Terrible things are happening. People are suffering in horrific ways right now in this country, unjust ways, awful ways. None of this is to erase or minimize that. It is to say that from the perspective even of Jewish history, it's only 3,000 years. That's a drop in the bucket in terms of the 4 billion years of this planet, not to mention the universe. But this is nothing. This is an eye blink. The Third Reich was an eye blink in human history, a really terrible blink, right? Scarring, traumatizing. But Jewish tradition, Jewish history reminds us, yeah, tyrants come and go. That's part of what our job is to be the witness of that, the embodiment of the human spirit that doesn't come and go. The spirit that if you're religious, you would say, okay, we're created in God's image. That's why these people can never, no matter how horrible they are, they can't extinguish our spirit. We outlive them, it outlives them together. Even if individually we perish, this spirit in us survives and we rebuild and we go on and we have a chance to do it better the next time. Um, so the ability to see time cyclically in this long in this long sense, and of course to see time as pervaded by relationship with divinity that we're kind of in charge of. God has no choice but to relate to us, but we have a choice whether or not we want to frame our lives as being in relation to God. And that power can't be taken away from us.
As usual, I'm taking notes because that's how I am able to integrate what you have said. For all these years, I have always taken notes when I'm with you, Joy. And when we talked also, and we talked about theocracy,
Mm,
autocracy, and democracy. And they may be theoretical, but we are really in deep with all those right now. And I have coined you in my head as my Jewish Heather Cox Richardson.
oh my gosh.
And for me, I feel like there's a way of navigating these times that knowing the theoretical
Mm,
is really helpful in the practical. And so if you could
yeah.
expand upon that.
Um, so one of the things about the Torah is that it provided the DNA for the religious traditions that came after it. And for better and for worse, the way when we pass on our genes to our kids, there's stuff that's great and there's stuff that's not so great. So the Torah's original model of the relationship between God, humanity, and human history, the governance of human affairs, was theocracy. That was the idea. Israelites were not supposed to have actual rulers. They were supposed to be scattered tribes, and they would have, I guess, what we would now call pop-up leaders. You don't need rulers because when you're in trouble, God will send you a leader of some sort or another. And if you read the book of Judges, you see that this worked out quite badly for the most part. Um, and if you continue with that history, like people didn't like it because what it meant, people would forget God when things were going well, and then when they cried out to God, things already sucked. And there was no guarantee that whatever leader was raised up would turn out to be the leader you need afterward. The Winston Churchill effect, it would later come to be called. Winston was great during World War II, but he really sucked during peacetime. So that happened a lot. So in the books of Kings and Chronicles, you can read about the Israelites were like, we don't want this. We want a king. We want to be like everybody else. We want to have a human government that we understand. We don't want it to have to be mystified. We're living under God's rule and we just have to wait for God to do whatever God is going to do. Um, and uh, the prophet who inaugurated the first king started that by saying, basically, be careful what you wish for. Here's all the terrible things that your king will do to you. Some of which I think our current president is, doing right now, but it's just a characteristic of monarchical rulers. You center power in one human figure, and the very predictable things go wrong. Um, the entire biblical history of Jewish self-government is a history of failures, um, of various kinds, including massacres, genocidal stuff, some fratricidal things. It just rarely worked out very well. And in some ways, I think it was probably, the rabbis were probably grateful that it wasn't an issue under Roman rule, because then you didn't have to keep hoping for this exact right combination of divine leadership through prophets and priests and then the human ruler. That was that was off the table for a long time. Um, However, that DNA, that theocratic DNA, of course, persisted it was dormant in Jewish tradition, and until the founding of the State of Israel. It's made a rebound. There are people who want a theocratic State of Israel. Um, but it was like alive and well in Christianity in different ways, in the form of, when the head of a Roman Empire became Christian, there was a lot of intermingling of church and state that became part of Christianity. But they really got the model, I think, came from the Torah, the idea that a really just government would be one that conforms to some idea of religion. Um, and it still makes sense. You want a government that's all good all the time. Well, human beings aren't all good all the time. Huh. Anybody know someone who's all good all the time? Oh, yeah, God is supposed to be all good all the time. And then you end up with theocracy, which of course is run by human beings. So it really was not a way out. In Europe, that got translated into the divine right of kings, right? It's very convenient for kings. Whoever is the king is divinely entitled to be king, and reflects God's will for rulership on earth. And as we all know, that didn't work out very well either. So in the 18th century, starting earlier, really, um, some people started to have an idea of getting rid of monarchs and getting rid of this um, striving toward theocracy, this idea that there can be a holy government that always does everything right, and instead wanted to find a way for people to govern ourselves. And by people, of course, I mean wealthy white men. Um, that was part of the idea. But even that's pretty revolutionary idea that compared to theocracy, which says human beings should not be governing themselves. They should just get laws from God and follow God's laws. And right, wait, so total human passivity on the one side. Various forms of theocracy have different levels of that passivity, but most people are passive when you have one monarch, whether it's theocratic or not. So the fantasy of wanting a theocracy, what theocracy is supposed to be, is alive and well and persistent, and I personally can understand the pull toward it. The people who said, you know what, we have really tried this for a really long time and it has never worked. Why don't we look for a way that human beings can decide who is going to rule over us and make those decisions, even though we suck? So the people who came up with this said, yeah, human beings are foolish, short-sighted, terrible memories, and most of us are corrupted by any power we have, except for the ones who were corrupted before we had power, right? That's most of humanity. So the idea of self-government by a species like this, it doesn't have a lot to recommend to it. However, they felt that the key to the best possible government outcome was a process that would make everybody, number one, make everybody feel like they had a stake in being ruled. Okay, so one thing democracy is, it's not sacred, it's not holy, it does need to be defended and practiced well, but really it's just a way of making decisions, right? It's a management technique. And it's a way of making decisions that's designed to manufacture consent of the governed. So the advantage of being an autocrat is you don't have to care about the consent of the governed, right? So the present administration is working quite hard to make it irrelevant whether people are consenting to being ruled by this administration or not. Democracy is designed to do the opposite. It says everybody agrees to play by these rules, and therefore we all consent to live with the consequences of them. And that doesn't work very well unless you also build in a lot of change. Remember, the people who designed this process for human beings to govern ourselves were very skeptical about human beings. Um, in ancient Greece, which was a different form of democracy, they would rotate every year all of the leadership roles among this, small group of entitled guys. But still, like they that was the way that they were trying to do it. But in democracy, you do it by periodically having elections so that when you lose, you still consent to be governed because you know you will have another chance. And you consent to be governed because in our democracy, there are levels of representation, right? So I get to live in a blue state, right? Where, sure, the Democratic Party here is corrupt and disappointing in many different ways, usually. However, right, I know that there are places where I can live where I'll be represented by people who reflect some of my values and stuff. So representative democracy, frequent change, so that no matter how much you hate what you're dealing with, you know that you're going to have a chance to change it. The idea, of course, is to keep the citizens engaged. Democracy works best when you have people saying, oh, well, we'll get you next time. And that's like in 2 years or the next year's special election or whatever. And so you keep engaged, you keep informed, and you keep doing it. And God doesn't have to have any role in it. So if you embrace democracy, you can't blame God for the government you get. It's not it's not God's fault. Um, we are gambling on ourselves, and we're choosing to live with the consequences of um, that gamble. And so the question of where is God in relation to current events, I have to kind of go back to it's a little lowbrow, but there's a saying about that people are just ways of beer moving from one place to another. I don't know if you've ever heard that. that saying? If you are a beer drinker, um, you know that it's a diuretic, right? So from one perspective, right, from beer's perspective, a human being is just a way to get from one place to another because you're not going to stay in the human being very long. Um, I would say that in a democracy, we have to see the answer to where is God as we are ways for God to get from one place to another in the human world, right? Can say God created and secures and radiates the universe. I would say that divine presence pervades the universe. Yes. But when you look at the social world, at the human world, the way God effectively gets into that, there's only one way in, and that is through us and our relations to one another. So I would say if we, as citizens of a democracy, or what's left of a democracy, but still a democracy, although one that is impaired, want to answer the question, where is God in relation to this current uh, crisis of tyranny and autocracy? Um, we need to start with ourselves and say, well, how am I transporting God from one place to another through the body politic? Because we are the body politic.
So, as an example of moving God through the world, how do you express or how do you help move God through the world? And what are you seeing happening in the world that
Mm.
reflects that?
Mm. I don't, theologically, I don't divide God into parts, the good, God just is all good, all this, all that, all the other thing. You don't have much God left if you do that. However, for me, there are ways people can behave to one another and in the world that I feel makes God visible to me, right? Things that people can do. Um, and I don't do this very much. I'm housebound by illness, but I remember after our first go round with these dudes, um, I remember thinking it is really important whenever I'm on the street, whenever I'm riding the subway, however I feel, I need to meet people's eyes. I need to smile. Need to make people feel seen and recognized as human. Because one of the things that authoritarianism does is it makes us walk with our eyes lowered. We don't want to be noticed. We don't want to attract attention because we're always waiting for a blow to fall. So one of the ways we can carry God through the world, or just, if you're not into God, one of the ways we can resist authoritarianism just by the way we move through the world is by doing that. Every relation to another person is an opportunity to either affirm and reflect their humanity in the way we treat them, or to do the opposite. When I was a labor, I hesitate to say labor union activist, I was in the dinkiest union you could imagine, the State Bar of California's chapter of the SEIU union. They were just starting to try to organize office workers, and we didn't have a lot of them, but I was the president, and um, I'm sorry, I lost where I was going somewhere profound and brilliant. Just imagine some profound, brilliant insight. Credit to me, but have it yourself. Um, wow, really not sure where that was going. It did seem like it was going to be good though. Yeah. Okay. So, um, the ways that yes, right. That's it. One of my mentors, don't get a lot of training when you're in a dinky little union. When you assume leadership, it's like, oh, we've got a volunteer, give her everything, you know. But I did have a mentor who said one of the things she'd learned is there are no cheap shots. They all cost you. And I didn't understand what she meant at first, but one of the ways that people who feel powerless and oppressed or afraid compensate for that is we lash out. We make fun of people, right? Late night comedy has been doing this for years. And if you talk to people who, a lot of people who identify as politically conservative, they carry a lot of bitterness for the way that conservatives and people in what we call red states are portrayed in the media and looked down on and made fun of. Um, and those are cheap shots, and they are costing us. They all cost us, right? When we circulate those memes, and I face this test every morning when I don't spend much time on Facebook, but I post things and I look at what's there, and there'll be something, oh, what a good burn that is. And if I like that and I circulate it, I will feel stronger. I've done something. I've struck back. I have done what a priest who works with gangs in LA says gang members transmit the pain that they've received. They don't know how to transform it. The key to getting out of a gang is you learn to transform the pain. You transform the terrible things that have been done to you and channel them for good, as opposed to just saying, wow, I was made to feel like crap, but at least I can make other people feel like crap. I was made to live in fear, but at least I can make other people live in fear. Right? So we have those choices all the time in the age of social media. And remembering that there are no cheap shots, that they do all cost us. I don't think social media is a great place for very much of anything, but certainly not for serious conversation. But if you're somebody who engages in conversations of a political nature or cross-cultural boundaries, it can be important work. But the way you do it really, really matters. You don't have many words, so extra weight will be given to each of your words. You don't have body language and other ways to signal your tone of voice. So saying things in ironic ways can easily be translated by people who are assuming that you're going to hurt them into things that hurt them. So we can do tshuva, in other words, in the ways that we treat one another. I know that I am void, and I feel like, wow, God is more in this world that I'm afraid of when I'm in my dark moments. Whenever I see people standing in solidarity with one another who are being targeted, and whenever I see people standing in solidarity with people who are different from the way they are. And this is something that you can do even if you are a targeted person, right? You can, the the term ally, it's been used and abused in different kinds of ways, but I think signaling that you're standing in solidarity with people who are hurt or afraid, that is a way that we can move God from one place to another. We can do it with monetary contributions. We can do it with contributions of our time. We can do it by showing up at celebrations that people are having, and again, very Jewish thing. Also, very much part of the Black tradition of resistance. You keep celebrating, no matter how awful the circumstances you're living in are. One of the beautiful things about the Jewish tradition, we have a highly elaborated tradition of tzedakah. It's not charity for us. The idea is we've been given resources for the purpose of practicing justice. We are a way that money moves from one place to another in a way that reflects the presence of God. Tzedakah means justice. We're supposed to make contributions in ways that make the world a better, and in particular, a more just place. And if we think of ourselves that way, right, it's like, oh, great. Well, so I'd make contributions sporadically. And then I heard a high holiday sermon. I try to let those change my life. It doesn't always work for the best, but um, a high holiday sermon where someone was saying that they didn't, um, they had never given very much tzedakah because they were always marginal, poor. But Jewish tradition says that everybody, even a poor person, is obligated to give tzedakah. In other words, no one is so poor that we don't have something to give to one another. And that's what this guy said. It's not like, oh, great, I'm being taxed no matter how little I have. No, you're being reminded of your power to give, which can't be taken away from you, right? As long as we have contact with other people, we have power to give something. And he said he started setting aside a certain portion of his income. He made a bank account that he would put into it, and he didn't think he could do it and still live because he thought he was living paycheck to paycheck. But it turned out that he could. And he said nothing has ever made him feel richer than when he gives that money, because it's a way of saying, ah, because when you live paycheck to paycheck, I did that for a while, you live in constant fear and a constant sense of scarcity and vulnerability, and you feel like you don't have anything to give. You just need everything you have, or you're not going to make it. And he said when he started giving even small amounts of money, he suddenly felt rich. Wow, I'm somebody who can afford to do this. So I've continued that practice. And again, it's a way that you can do it with belief in God, and you can do it without belief in God. I think it works either way.
I wanted to give an opportunity to folks to possibly ask questions. If you have any, please put them in the chat. You can raise your hand. I'm going to ask Rose to look at the chat because I had to move to my phone, and it's I wouldn't miss a second. And if anybody wants to physically raise their hand or to use the raise the hand button, you're welcome to. But Joy, you always have a sense of humor. And I think our people have had to remain having a sense of humor. And I'm curious if you've ever explored humor in terms of the God, which I think that would be an amusing um, exploration. But I'm curious about your approach to humor, and because you talk about connection so often, and I think humor is a wonderful connector, and maybe sarcasm's not the best way, and the memes are not the best way. But I'd love to hear, if nobody else has anything right now, to hear a little bit about your sense of humor.
Well, one thing I will say is laughter is spiritual resistance. Um, Not everyone has a sense of humor, but as a species, I am pretty sure that we started laughing as soon as we reached a human level of consciousness. And they keep pushing the time of that backward. Basically, as soon as we became human enough to have a sense of self-awareness and to recognize when you have a sense of self-awareness, you know that there's a difference. Or we can see things from more perspectives than one. So one of the basis for a lot of humor is just seeing things from colliding perspectives at once. One of the reasons that I think every oppressed group cultivates this, and every oppressed group thinks that it's theirs, right? Um, well, we've always had a special sense of humor. We've always laughed so much together. Jews are very proud of this. Again, it's something that you can do no matter how little power you have. You can laugh. You can raise an eyebrow over how stupid your government is for oppressing you this way. Because one of the things that we can count on with human-run governments is that they will not only be corrupt and brutal, if they become tyrannical, they will also be really stupid. If you look at an org chart and you look at the old cartoon Zippy the Pinhead, you realize that an org chart is a pinhead. The person at the top is the head of the pin. The thing about Zippy the pinhead, not very bright. So when you centralize power in one figure, that figure will never have enough information to make smart decisions. They always make dumb decisions. Those dumb decisions may hurt people, a lot of people. They will. However, there's always something to laugh about. Did you hear the one about the guy in charge of Health and Human Services who was trying to eradicate vaccines? I mean, you gotta laugh, right? Like, what an idea for someone to come up with. And you know that he's not laughing, which I think makes it even the biggest pratfall in the history of public health. And he doesn't get the joke that he is, or the millions of people who will suffer as a result of it, unfortunately. But yeah, I think humor is a powerful form of human resistance. Um, and there's a question about whether we tell jokes that help people feel like they're in a community, right? One of the reasons that I feel like when I'm teaching, it's a failure if no one's laughing, is because laughing both opens us up to new possibilities of being, and there's nothing you need more as an oppressed person than new possibilities of being, right? Again, authoritarians, they want to shut that down. They don't want you to be able to imagine things being any other way. They want you too scared. They want you too desperate. They want you to hurt. They want you too angry. Anger is not great for the imagination either. But laughter is. Laughter opens us up to possibilities. And when we laugh with other people, we create community. We create a sense of mutual understanding. And again, can't be stopped, can't be shut down. The question, I would say, is, and it's a tough line to draw, and I don't always do it well, is do we laugh in ways that create a sense of community in where this is we and that's us, right? This is we laughing at us, or this is we excluding us, or this is we and you can only laugh at this if you share certain characteristics, right? If you think about that, all of these are ways that laughter is promoting things that I think most everybody here would say they don't actually believe is good to have in the world. There are also ways of sharing laughter that do the opposite. They open us up. It's the laughter, like this is what I would try to do with the meeting of people's eyes on public transportation. Really hard in New York. People walk with their eyes down, not because of authoritarianism, it's because they're in New York, but to meet someone's eyes, just like, can you believe we're sharing this situation? Can you believe there hasn't been a subway for 15 minutes and it keeps telling us that one is due in 1 minute, right? Just that moment of shared connection, that is not excluding anyone. It's not putting anyone down. That is making a we, center is where we are, but that doesn't have a boundary and it doesn't need a boundary in order to exist. Very hard for oppressed people to do it, right? Because it's easier to mobilize ourselves by thinking about us in opposition to them, how badly we've been treated by them. This is part of Jewish tradition too. It's part of the survival toolkit. Think about anti-Semitism. Think about past massacres. Think about our suffering as though it's the only suffering that really matters, or it's the suffering that matters most. Um, Ultimately, for a lot of very oppressed 19th century Jews in shtetls, I think it became hard to think of non-Jews as human. There are Jewish theologies developed in that time that are like, well, yeah, human beings have souls, but Jews really have souls. We have the special souls. We have the souls that are rooted in God, and not those other souls, right? So that is a powerful way of creating a community that's built to survive, but it comes at a terrible cost, which I think we have probably all seen, because it means that Jewish tradition has taught us to dehumanize other people. It's taught us to minimize other people's suffering and other people's oppression. And for me as an American Jew, like growing up white, middle class, and Jewish in a place where there weren't a lot of Jews, I felt like being Jewish was a get out of jail free in terms of being responsible for being part of systems of oppression. I didn't say it that way to myself as a kid, but I also felt that way. Like I don't have to pay attention to, you know, whiteness and other ways, like who's not here in my classroom is all white. Why is that? I know that not everybody in my city is white. Where are all the other people? I didn't have to do that because I was Jewish. So yeah, so I think that there's tshuva that I think that this can be a good thing. I think that if we take this on as tshuva, a way of making the most out of Jewish tradition, of saying, yeah, this is a survival tool that this people has developed, and we are going to choose not to use it. We're going to choose to find ways of surviving that emphasize the humanity, even of those we see as them, because we know the cost historically, politically, but also in terms of our own souls, because this is the other thing. There are no cheap shots, they all cost you. Whenever we dehumanize other people, we become less human. And this is, this is something that can enable us to have compassion. There were these Buddhist nuns who were Tibetan Buddhists. I believe they were imprisoned by Chinese, brutal repression of Tibetans and Tibetan Buddhism. And so these nuns were arrested and they were thrown into what they knew was, we would call it basically a concentration camp. They were going to be tortured. They would probably never come out again. And as they were going in, they had a conversation about what they were most afraid of. And they both agreed that what they were most afraid of was losing their compassion. They were afraid that as they were tortured, they would be unable to feel compassion for the people who were torturing them, the people who were jailing them. And they're saying this, they're telling a story on the other side, and they said, actually, we didn't. We didn't lose our compassion for our torturers. One way you can maintain that compassion is to remember that actually it works that way for them too. That when they quote unquote, they dehumanize, quote unquote, us, they are dehumanizing themselves. This is another way that there's no us and them, right? We can't dehumanize anyone without dehumanizing ourselves. You can have a much better situation as a dehumanized person, but you're a dehumanized person. You are cut off from what you could be. And that is a tragedy.
Thank you for this incredibly important conversation and the amount of tools and wisdom and strategies that we have heard you share in 1 hour. With the high holidays coming and the hearts floating and the togetherness that I feel and the connections that you always create are are powerful, empowering, and I'm so grateful. And I know we all are. We will have opportunities to get any further questions to Joy. Um, Rose is going to put a link in the chat so that we can get your feedback and help us with future gatherings like this. And Rose, please also put in the ways in which you did. Most importantly is how to connect with Joy through your work, and um, and there will be some future programs that are going to be put in the chat as well. Thank you all so much for being here. We will send this poll to you also when we send you the recording, probably tomorrow. And again, so much gratitude to you, Joy, for everybody being here, because we're all part of the solution of saving our humanity within and with each other.
I just want to say thank you to Rebecca and Mackenzie and Rose and Sojourn for having these conversations. So important, and for blessing me by inviting me to be part of them, and for all of you to be here with me. Really, I'm so grateful. Thank you.